This is ancient China for the rise of civilization. And the China we see today has the longest continuous civilization of the world. Modern China is very much like its civilizations of the past. Like the civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, the Chinese civilization was centered on the fertile plain of a great river, which was the Huanghe or Yellow River. However, it really differed from primary civilizations in the types of domesticates that fueled its development. So we had millets and pigs were the main food sources early on. Then we had dogs, wheat, barley, which came later. So during its early stages, the development of ancient China was a world apart from the other centers of civilization, separated, like we saw in Egypt, by various barriers. One Han Dynasty envoy who returned from Afghanistan in 126 BC reported that there were cities, mansions, and houses as in China. He didn't even realize there were other civilizations around. So we also know that the Chinese scribes were usually scrupulously accurate. And we know a lot, but we don't know a lot, and we'll talk about why that is. But the early Chinese were known for their many inventions, which became important to the West, which were gunpowder, printing, paper, silk, and other things. So everything here started around the Huanghe or Yellow River. So what you're going to see is the earliest civilization started in that area. Now, what's the problem with rivers? Just like we saw with Indus, this was not a good river. It would overrun its channels. They tried doing dikes early on, but there was so much silt. The good thing about silt was that they could grow stuff in it. The bad stuff was that, of course, a lot of cities got buried. So again, very early on in the area where you see Anyang, Longshan, they were very isolated. And what's the problem with rivers again? We see a lot of flooding. There were rulers who had to move the capitals many times because of these rivers flooding. And again, this shows its isolation early on. There's another view of the area where civilization started in China. Here's a picture of the river, the Yellow River. So the Neolithic occurred from about 5000 to 3000 BC in terms of the Yangshuo culture. The entire Neolithic was about 5,000 years, and Banpo was one of its early settlements. And this is a recreation of it. So the housing style was wattle and daub, which means mud and stick housing. Now, I threw this in here because if you've ever gone to China, they're really big on eating all kinds of animals. And so when I was there, we were on a long bus ride, and the tour guide had a lot of propaganda for us. But one of the jokes he told was, what are the only things in China with 4 legs that people don't eat? And the answer was tables and chairs. So if you go to a market in China, they actually like to see what they're going to eat alive, and then they kill it for you. So you'll see monkeys, you see dogs, cats, creepy crawly things, all kinds of weird stuff. So it is very different if you ever have the opportunity to go. Let's get back to Banpo. So there were 5 archaeological layers, and so this just is kind of a recreation. So they had millet. Millet is a grain which they stored in pits. So they raised and ate dogs and pigs. They processed their grains with stone blades. They relied on hunting and gathering. They made this coarse red pottery, and we're not really sure a lot about it, but we know that Bon Po was occupied for a number of years, and they found about 100 houses surrounded by a defensive moat. 24 of the houses and 160 of the storage pits have been excavated, and we know that the city was subdivided. They actually had a kiln center for making pottery and a cemetery. Very early on, they find evidence of hemp, but the principal crop was millet. They grew hemp probably as a fiber, not what you're thinking to smoke. And they also, there is evidence that they used silk because they found silkworms. And they also found spinning needles and whorls. And so they found knives, spearheads, battle axes. The other thing is that they found children buried in large redware pottery jars near the houses. And the adults were buried in rows in the cemetery. Most of the graves included food and eating utensils, but one grave of a little girl has been described as a wooden tomb which contained rich funerary gifts, including a green jade pendant, a string of 63 bone beads, and ceramic vessels. So what can you infer from this? Well, as you learned from last week, this is how you tell social stratification. If everyone else is buried with nothing and then you find somebody with all this neat stuff, you can assume they're either of a higher social class, they're royalty, whatever. And it is thought that at this time we already start seeing the beginnings of ancestor worship. But we'll move on to the Longshan culture. During this period, there was evidence of increasing warfare and class differentiation. So we're still seeing semi-subterranean houses, but the population increased because we start seeing rice and we start seeing more houses. And it is thought that they had to grow more crops. We start seeing the evidence of using sheep and ox and horses. And already at this time, our villages are surrounded by a wall or rampart. So again, were they keeping out the water? Could very well be, or were they keeping out other people? We also know that silk is being processed during this time. Now, the Longshan period is known for this black pottery that you're seeing. During this time, we start seeing evidence for the practice of scapulomancy. Basically, what they would do is, and you see the beginnings of writing also on this bone, but they'll take a scapula of an animal and they'll ask a question. They'll put it in the fire, and depending on how the bone cracks, there's somebody there who could read the cracks in the bone, just like there's people who can read our palms. It's also thought that during this time we start seeing the beginnings of shamanistic rituals, because we start seeing mythical animals that were painted or carved onto the pottery. And we also start seeing this social differentiation because 90% of the burials have few or no grave goods, and then you have 10% that have all kinds of neat stuff. It is also thought that during this time period we start seeing the beginnings of a patriarchy, because this is the symbol Zu, which is a phallus, but it went on to mean male ancestor. And here's some more of the pottery from this time period. And then we come to the Xia dynasty. What we know, or what legend has, is prior to the Xia dynasty, the throne was passed on to the next successor by merit, not birth. And one kin group whose leader was named Yu founded the Xia dynasty. Legend says that Yu's kingsmen elevated the rulers because of Yu's particular achievement in containing the Great Flood. You spent 13 years mastering the waters without once returning home to see his family. According to legend, he organized an irrigation water project and controlled floods and improved the fields. And they think he did this by organizing huge labor forces. But what we do know is the first emperor destroyed all the books and killed all the scholars. So this is all open to speculation and legend. So we do know, obviously, people lived during this time period, but we don't know a lot about it, other than what legend says. So here's some artifacts from this time period. And here's some of the archaeological excavations that are going on.